The man you're looking at right now is 62-year-old security guard Frank Wilson. Students called him Slow Frank because he would get out of breath climbing stairs. Even when drinking his coffee, his hands would shake. Everyone thought he was old and weak. But on March 15, 2019, when an armed attacker entered the school, students learned who Frank really was. What happened that day lasted only 30 seconds. But those 30 seconds saved the lives of 800 students. And if you listen to this story until the end, you'll learn how a man hid his identity for 40 years and revealed his true face at the critical moment. March 15, 2019, Friday morning, 8:30 a.m. Another calm morning was beginning at Riverside High School as usual. As students walked toward their classrooms, 62-year-old security guard Frank Wilson stood at the main entrance in his usual spot, coffee in hand. Frank had been working at the school for 3 years. After retiring, he had gotten bored sitting at home and took this job. Students had nicknamed him Slow Frank because he really did move slowly. "Look, Frank is out of breath on the stairs again," they would laugh behind his back. Frank was used to this situation. He would respond with a smile, "Getting old is tough, kids. You'll understand someday." But the students didn't know that Frank's morning coffee ritual was actually his attempt to break the connection with his past. Every sip was an attempt to forget a piece of his old life. But Frank had a secret that no one knew. His real name wasn't Frank Wilson. He was retired Colonel Franklin Washington, who had served in the U.S. Special Forces from 1978 to 2018. In his 40-year career, he had participated in covert operations in 15 different countries. In Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, he had undertaken the most dangerous missions. He was known by the code name Ghost because he would neutralize enemies without them ever seeing him. In a single operation, he had single-handedly neutralized a 20-person terrorist group. But when he retired in 2018, he was war-weary. He had nightmares at night and would startle at sudden sounds. He wanted a peaceful life. That's why he changed his identity and settled in a small town. Doctors had diagnosed him with PTSD. "Try to forget your past," they had said. Frank was trying to do just that. Every morning he drank the same coffee, walked with the same slow steps, trying to be calm enough not to harm anyone. But his body didn't forget. His muscles, reflexes, 40 years of training, they were all still there, just sleeping. Frank was determined never to awaken this sleeping beast. Until that morning. That morning, as Frank was sipping his coffee, the metal detector at the door went off. It was 8:45 a.m. A late student was running in. "Sorry, Frank, I'm late," Frank smiled. "No problem, Tommy, but try to get up earlier next time." Tommy ran to his class. Frank returned to his coffee. This was his last normal moment. At 8:52 a.m., a black sedan stopped in the schoolyard parking area. Frank noticed the car's windows were too dark. He tried to see the license plate, but the distance was too far. His instincts told him something was wrong. His 40 years of experience could smell danger. This feeling had saved his life in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria. Every time this feeling had warned him. Now he had the same feeling. The person getting out of the car was wearing a black hooded sweatshirt. His face wasn't visible. He had a backpack and was walking strangely. Frank's experienced eyes recognized that walk. This was the walk of someone carrying something heavy. Frank gripped his coffee cup a little tighter. His heart was starting to race, but there was no change in his face. For 40 years, he had learned to hide his emotions. As the man approached the school, Frank could see his details more clearly. About 25 years old, medium height. But most importantly, his eyes. Frank recognized those eyes. These were the eyes of someone determined to kill. At 8:54 a.m., the man approached the school entrance. Frank could see the shape of the man's backpack more clearly. His heart began to race. That shape looked very much like a rifle case, but Frank didn't panic. Instead, his 40 years of training kicked in. "Hello, can I help you?" Frank asked, keeping his voice as calm as possible. The tone of voice, body language, everything was calculated. He wanted to avoid provoking the man while buying time to assess the situation. The man raised his head. His eyes were red, his face sweaty. "I want to register here," he said. Frank noticed the man was about 25 years old and clearly past student age. "Unfortunately, you need to make an appointment for registration procedures with the assistant principal." "Shut up!" the man suddenly shouted. At that moment, Frank's 40 years of experience kicked in. The change in the man's tone of voice, the tension in his body language, the madness in his eyes. He had seen all of this before. This man was very dangerous. Frank slowly placed his coffee cup on the ground. This movement looked like an everyday action to an ordinary person. But in reality, Frank was moving into combat position. His hands were now free, his reflexes ready. "Okay, calm down. We'll do whatever you want," Frank said. His voice was still calm, but a storm was raging inside. The warrior he had suppressed for 40 years was slowly awakening. The man began to open the zipper of his backpack. "Today everyone will remember me. Today I will be a hero." When Frank saw what was coming out of the bag, his heart stopped. A semi-automatic rifle and ammunition clips beside it. At that moment, Frank Wilson died. Franklin Washington was born. At 8:56 a.m., the 62-year-old slow security guard disappeared. In his place came one of the world's most elite soldiers. Everything in his body changed. 40 years of military training, reflexes, muscle memory. All of it instantly activated. The old shaky hands disappeared. In their place came precise and deadly hands. The slowly moving body was now like lightning. The moment the man pulled out the rifle, Frank moved. First 5 seconds. Before the man could fully raise the rifle, Frank struck the man's wrist with his right hand. This was a technique from Krav Maga. The blow was so precise and powerful that the man's hand went numb and the rifle fell to the ground. At the same time, he grabbed the man's throat with his left hand. This was a movement he had repeated thousands of times over 40 years. His fingers applied pressure to the man's windpipe at exactly the right angle. 6 to 15 seconds. The man tried to push Frank away, but Frank moved behind the man and put him in a chokehold. This was the sleeper hold technique he had learned in military training. With 40 years of experience, he knew exactly which point to apply how much pressure to. The man was struggling, trying to escape, but Frank's grip was stronger than iron. "Calm down, I won't hurt you," Frank whispered. His voice was completely different now. This was a commander's voice. 16 to 25 seconds. The man began to pass out. Frank laid him on the ground and tied his hands behind his back. He took the rifle and secured it. He removed the magazine, checked the ammunition. Every movement was professional, calculated. 26 to 30 seconds. Frank reached the school's PA system and announced, "Lockdown! Lockdown! All students stay in your classrooms." His voice filled the entire school. This was a command voice. Everyone immediately obeyed. It had lasted exactly 30 seconds. The attacker was lying unconscious on the ground. The rifle was secured. 800 students were safe. Frank picked up his coffee cup again and sat back in his place as if nothing had happened, but his hands were no longer shaking. His breathing wasn't labored. That old man had disappeared. Police arrived 5 minutes later. "What happened here?" asked the police officer. Frank said calmly, "This man tried to carry out an armed attack on the school. I neutralized him." The police officer looked at Frank in amazement. "You did? How?" "I was lucky," Frank said with a smile. But when the police officer examined the condition of the man on the ground, he was surprised. The hands were professionally tied. The weapon had been secured. This wasn't something that could be done by chance. This was a professional intervention. When police investigated the man's identity, shocking facts emerged. The man was a 25-year-old named Marcus Reed. In the last 6 months, he had watched violent content videos online, bought weapons, and researched school attacks. In his backpack, they found not only the rifle, but also 200 rounds of ammunition, a hand grenade, and a school plan. According to the plan, he would first target the cafeteria, then the library. If Frank hadn't intervened, this could have been one of the biggest school attacks in American history. The next day, Frank came to work again. Students looked at him differently. They no longer called him Slow Frank. They respectfully called him Uncle Frank. "Uncle Frank, how did you do that yesterday?" a student asked. Frank sipped his coffee. "Sometimes people can do things they don't expect when necessary." But there was deep fatigue in his eyes. The warrior he had suppressed for 40 years had awakened again, and Frank was trying to put him back to sleep. But one of the students, Jessica Martinez, was curious. Jessica worked for the school newspaper and had an investigative spirit. The reflexes Frank had shown that day made her think. She searched for Frank Wilson on the internet. Not many results came up, but something caught her attention. Frank's social security number only went back 3 years. Wasn't that strange? Jessica dug deeper. She researched old military records, and finally, she found a photo of a retired colonel named Franklin Washington. The photo was from 20 years ago, but the facial features looked very much like Frank. Jessica decided to talk to Frank. One day after school, she went to Frank. "Uncle Frank, can I talk to you?" "Of course, Jessica, what's up? Will you tell me who you really are?" Frank looked at Jessica for a long time. Then he smiled. "I'm just a security guard, Jessica." "No, you're not. You're Colonel Franklin Washington, aren't you?" Frank's smile disappeared. "Jessica, why are you bringing this up?" "Because you're a hero, and people should know the truth." Frank told Jessica the truth. "Yes, I was Franklin Washington. I served in the military for 40 years. But I'm not that man anymore. I'm just a retiree who wants to live a quiet life. But what you did yesterday? What I did yesterday showed me that I can't escape my past. But this isn't the life I chose." Jessica saw the fatigue in Frank's eyes. "So why don't you want anyone to know?" "Because, Jessica, war changes a person. I'm no longer that warrior. I'm just an old man who wants to protect you." That day, Jessica made an important decision. She wouldn't share Frank's secret with anyone, but she would write an article titled "Heroes Among Us" in the school newspaper. In the article, she would write that real heroes aren't people with superpowers, but ordinary people who do the right thing at the right time. Months passed, Frank's life returned to normal. But something had changed. Students treated him differently. They not only showed respect, but also enjoyed talking to him. "Uncle Frank, can you give life advice?" "Uncle Frank, what do you think I should do in the future?" Frank patiently answered these questions because he understood that his real duty wasn't just to protect the school, but to guide these young people. A year later, Marcus Reed's trial was held. Frank was heard as a witness in court. The prosecutor asked, "Mr. Wilson, can you tell us what you experienced that day?" Frank said calmly, "A young man was trying to harm the school. I stopped him, that's all. But how were you able to move so quickly?" "Sometimes adrenaline gives people unexpected strength." The judge turned to Frank. "Mr. Wilson, hundreds of lives were saved thanks to you. How do you feel about this?" Frank thought, "I just did my job. Every parent should be able to send their child to school safely." Marcus Reed was sentenced to 25 years in prison. After the trial, Reed's mother came to Frank, crying, "Thank you for not killing my son. He's sick, but he's still my son." Frank held the woman's hand. "Ma'am, as a father myself, I understand. Your son will get help and recover." That day, Frank learned the most important lesson. True power wasn't in destroying your enemy, but in stopping them and protecting everyone. 2 years later, Frank decided to retire. On his last day of work, the entire school threw him a farewell party. Students, teachers, parents, everyone was there. In his speech, the principal said, "Frank Wilson wasn't just a security guard for us, he was our guardian angel." Frank didn't want to make a speech. He just said, "This school was my second home. You are my family too. I love you all very much." Jessica Martinez was graduating that day. She came to Frank. "Uncle Frank, I'm going to study journalism in college, and someday I'll write about real heroes." "Who are real heroes, Jessica? Not people with superpowers, ordinary people who do the right thing at the right time?" Frank smiled. "You're a very smart young woman, Jessica. You'll be successful." Frank's last day was as calm as his first day. He stood at the main entrance with his coffee in hand. But this time, students weren't calling him Slow Frank. They were calling him Hero Frank. At dismissal, a small child came to Frank. "Uncle, I want to be like you when I grow up." "How do you want to be?" "I want to be strong." Frank patted the child's head. "To be strong, your muscles don't need to be big. Your heart needs to be big." Frank Wilson left the school that day, but the legacy he left behind wasn't just that 30-second heroism. He had touched the lives of hundreds of young people, teaching them what true heroism was. And perhaps most importantly, he had taught himself. Instead of running from the past, use it for a better future. Today, Frank lives on a small farm. He still drinks his coffee, but his hands no longer shake. Because no one calls him Slow Frank anymore. They call him Hero Frank, and he knows he deserves this nickname. Frank's story teaches us something important. Real heroes aren't people with superpowers. They are ordinary people who do the right thing at the right time. Sometimes they can be a teacher, sometimes a doctor, sometimes an elderly security guard. Frank Wilson fought for his country for 40 years, but he showed his true heroism in those 30 seconds. Because those 30 seconds didn't just save the lives of 800 students, they also showed that true power lies not in violence, but in protection. And perhaps most importantly, Frank taught us this: our past doesn't define us. The choices we make today define us. Frank had tried to forget his warrior past, but when necessary, he used that power to protect. If this story taught you something, it's this: we all have a hero inside us. Sometimes that hero might be sleeping, but when the right moment comes, that hero awakens and does what's right. Like Frank Wilson, you too might be someone's hero someday. You don't need superpowers. You just need courage and the right heart. If you like this story, please don't forget to like and subscribe, because there are many more secret heroes like Frank Wilson in the world, and we will continue to share their stories with you.